Good evening and welcome to Casa and Gunner Short webinar on US presidential elections and its implications for India. Uh, we're going to have a panel here. It's an international panel with Professor Michael Rubin from USA, Ambassador Gurjit Singh, and Lieutenant General GAUTAM Moorthy. First and foremost, let me welcome them over. Good evening, gentlemen. Welcome, Professor Rubin. He's coming in from USA, and General Gautam Moorthy, who's joining us from Pune. Ambassador Gurjit Singh will just join us in about 5 to 10 minutes. So, at the outset, welcome to this webinar on the US presidential elections. That's the first thing. The second thing, the US presidential elections are virtually the mother of all elections, and this is an election year where there are more than 40 countries are going in for elections. It's a year of the democracy or the non-democracy, right? This election is important for the whole world. That's a that's a no-brainer. And we are going through a time where a whole lot of factors like wars, conflicts, have driven uncertainty into the whole system. And recent events in Bangladesh and have extended this uncertainty as far as India is concerned. And that too, it's in its relationship with USA. It's not only Bangladesh or relationship with Russia and XYZ. A lot of issues are there. 1 year back, India-US relations were on a global sweet spot kind of a thing. But today, there's a little bit of uncertainty on both sides. Okay. Apart from this, the year of the elections has thrown up surprises. We've had upsets in Venezuela, or rather a near upset in Venezuela, which is not being overturned. Bangladesh has created its own problems. And Argentina, where the complete right-wing candidate has come to power. A lot of surprises. It's also in India where we've thrown up a coalition for various factors. So a lot of things have changed. And by the end of the year, with the Sri Lanka elections and what's happening in Thailand and what's happening in Malaysia, a lot of change is in the air. Okay. It is in this context that this election gains importance. And especially with the West Asia configuration at its peak. The India-US strategic relations will be hostage to these elections to a large extent. Rather, not to the elections, to the outcome of these elections. Right. The question at hand is, will the national interest of both countries, which is almost permanent in nature, prevail? Or will they get subsumed by individualistic outcomes? Why individualistic outcomes? Normally, whether it's Republicans or Democrats, they have dealt with India almost evenly. But then there's always been in this relationship a certain amount of personality involved. And in this time, when the outcome happens in November, we're going to see either a known Trump as President Trump or an unknown Harris as President Kamala Harris. So that's the interest in this whole story and where it's going to go and what are the implications for India. What we'll do is I'll request each of you to give about your views in about 7 to 10 minutes. I'll not stop you. You could take as much time as you want, but if you could stick to this time, it'll be great. And then we'll see from where we can go. And as and when Ambassador Gurjit joins in, he'll join in at the tail end of our conversation. I'd first invite General Gautam Moorthy. Sir, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, General Shankar. And thank you, Professor Rubin, for joining us from all the way from the United States. Thank all your listeners, your viewers. Thank you all for your patience and for being here. We are, as General Shankar mentioned, about to embark on a very interesting discussion. A what-if discussion. What if Kamala Harris becomes the President of the United States? What if Donald Trump becomes the President of the United States? As we see it, uh, as General Shankar mentioned a little bit earlier, Kamala Harris has been sort of parachuted into this position after President Joe Biden muffed up his debate and had to literally pull out of the race. So I'll get to the point from an Indian perspective. What will happen if Kamala Harris becomes the president of the United States? What can we expect? Let me start with the positive. We can expect a strengthening of Indo-US relations. She has expressed support earlier for strong US-India partnership, which could lead to continued cooperation in defense, technology, and trade. Our agreements will continue. We are looking at increased immigration opportunities for our students and bright techies, because she has a more inclusive approach to immigration that would benefit Indian immigrants, especially given her own origin and her mother being an immigrant from India, so she understands this issue. We can expect enhanced climate cooperation. Her focus on climate action could lead to increased collaboration between the US and India on renewable energy, sustainable development, and we could see a lot of cultural exchanges between and people to people connections, given that she hails from General Shankar's city, Chennai. She has been coming there as a young girl for her holidays, meeting with her grandparents and her relatives. So we can expect a lot of that, although she considers herself black and Asian, but we could expect a lot of the cultural scene. What could be challenging with Harris presidency is about the trade imbalance with India, which could lead to increased pressure for more reciprocal trade arrangements. What I am concerned particularly with as a former army man is her policy and her stance on Kashmir. You see, may I would be saying something which could be controversial, but I would still like to utter it because I have felt often enough that except for Donald Trump, it was the tail wagging the dog insofar as the State Department and the President is concerned. We've seen it entirely in Mr. Biden's presidency, where the State Department was ruling the roost. And I'm afraid unless Kamala Harris, as President Kamala Harris, takes a strong stand, it would be the State Department that would be driving her policy on J&K, and therefore, by extension, the policy with our neighbors. We've seen what's happened recently in Bangladesh. We know what's happening in Nepal, in Myanmar, in Sri Lanka. I'll come to Pakistan later because I've got a few points on Pakistan. We are going to see a greater competition with China. Her tough stance on China might lead to increased pressure on India to take a stronger stand against China, because India is trying to maintain a very delicate balance with China. We are all aware of a strategic competition, and we are looking at a huge trade imbalance that India has, and India continues to rely on China very heavily for imports of certain commodities and items. Now, again, where the State Department, I feel, is going to step in on this expectation on, human rights and this exaggeration on human rights without understanding that India is a democracy, and running a country like India, which is much larger than the European Union and much more diverse than the European Union, is not even funny given our various languages, our subnationalism. So they would be, and sometimes our police admittedly gets very tough on prisoners. So there could be emphasis on human rights, which may lead to increased scrutiny, especially by the number of NGOs that the State Department funds across India and other countries. So there could be a problem here. But back to certain other implications, we are uncertain on how her stance on technical regulation will have, because it could be both positive and negative, and therefore our diaspora could be affected. As you know, there is a large Indian diaspora that lives in the United States that votes Democrats, but there are a number of them voting Republican too. And we saw it last time when Mr. Modi, as Prime Minister, visited the United States. As far as maintaining strategic partnerships is concerned, US India strategic partnership going strong. There will be cooperation, as I said, and it will continue to evolve. And both Harris as well as Trump are likely will support India's bid for a permanent seat in the UN Security Council. My talk on Kamala Trump's presidency will not be complete without the implications for Pakistan. Uh, as I said earlier, she has expressed strong support for the US India relationship, and this will continue. There will be potential strain on US Pakistan relations. We could expect a tighter security assistance, but conditional military aid to Pakistan. And Pakistan will be forced to cooperate on counterterrorism. She will also force Pakistan to take more decisive action against terrorist groups. She will come down heavily on Pakistan as for the human rights and sort of restoration of democracy, because we all know this elections has been a sham democracy. Her approach to Afghanistan may be more diplomatic and more collaborative than Joe Biden's, and she may involve Pakistan in regional talks to stabilize Afghanistan. Apart from that, she would look for ways to explore US Pakistan economic ties through trade and investment. That's what I have to say about Kamala Harris presidency. Now on to Donald Trump presidency. Now, as you said, we know who Donald Trump is. So you will continue to see an increased focus on economic nationalism by Trump's 2.0, with a focus on protecting American industries and jobs. He will prioritize economic nationalism. He will increase tariffs and trade restrictions on Indian goods. And if you recollect, his last presidency was marked by intense trade tensions with several countries, including India. He will continue to prioritize the America First policy. So that is something we should be prepared for. We should be prepared for changes in the immigration policy. He will get much tougher, not only on illegal immigration, which he will halt, but he will have restrictions on certain visa categories. Potential for the favorite Indian visa, the H-1B visa, we are likely to see some restrictions in Trump 2.0. But on the plus side, you're going to see increased emphasis on defense cooperation, particularly with regards to military sales, joint exercises. This trend is likely to continue. You're going to see a renewed focus on energy cooperation. So he's been a strong advocate for domestic energy production. He has promoted US energy interests globally. He would prioritize energy cooperation with India. Climate change policies, we all know Mr. Donald Trump's attitude towards climate change. He's skeptical of it. He would continue to prioritize domestic energy production over international climate agreements. Now, this could lead to some serious disagreements with India. Insofar as the Indo-Pacific is concerned, Trump's America First policy has led to a shift in US foreign policy priorities with a focus on Indo-Pacific region. With the Ukraine war going on there, he's not likely to focus as much upon it as Mr. Biden has been doing. He will continue to prioritize Indo-Pacific region and would lead to increased cooperation with India on regional and other security issues as a bulwark against China. You would have that said, you would have certain diplomatic tensions, but with India, I don't think it is going to be of such a large scale that we ought to be sort of concerned about. On global governance, he's skeptical about United Nations, WTO, WHO, and all these organizations. That's likely to continue. So there would be changes in the global governance structures. His attitude towards NATO, we all know, but I'm not getting into that. As insofar as Pakistan is concerned, which I said I would speak about, he's going to come down heavily on Pakistan to take decisive action against the terrorist groups. This Afghanistan conflict, he's likely to ignore them because as long as it doesn't affect the United States, he's not too concerned. He would be wary of a China-Pakistan alliance. And insofar as India-Pakistan alliance is concerned, Trump will seek to balance relationships, although in favor of India. Pakistan is not going to look at continued US aid. They will have to walk the talk because Trump is a man who shoots straight from the hip and he will tell Pakistan what they need to hear, which is to create pressure on terrorist groups. There will be strained diplomatic relations. And this might lead Pakistan to further strengthen ties with China. So, therefore, these are the major areas which I was looking at. We can expect from either a Kamala Harris presidency or a Donald Trump presidency. Thank you, General Shankar. That's all I have to say right now.
Thanks a lot, sir. At this stage, I'd like to welcome Ambassador Gurjit Singh also, sir. Welcome and thanks for getting into a offshore immediately after coming back from a trip abroad. Very indebted to you on this great gesture of yours. But let me just recount what General GAUTAM Moorthy put across. There are a lot of similarities with what Kamala Harris is going to give and what Trump is going to give. For example, the Indo-US relations will get stronger. There will be a lot of focus on the strategic cooperation and the strategic partnership. Both, like you said, will be tough on Pakistan, but with varying degrees, with varying emphasis. Both are going to be tough on China, and again with varying degrees, with varying emphasis. The major difference, as you brought out, is that Trump might not go in for global partnerships. He might, known as a deal maker. He would like to finish the Ukraine war and the West Asian war if feasible and see what kind of a deal he can make with China or others. So we'll see that shift which you did mention about, right? As far as Kamala Harris is concerned, we might see a little bump up on human rights issues and her differential stand on Kashmir and things like that, which will keep the irritants going in the India-US relationship. When it comes to Trump, the irritants would probably come in the form of trade imbalances, right? That's what is the known factor. Okay. So I think, sir, you've given the broad base of how this, relationship is going to go forward, and what we can expect from both the contestants. With this as a background, right? I'd like to invite Professor Michael Rubin. You are the person on ground. You know their prospects. You know their strengths and their fallibilities, and what their international outlooks are, and how will it affect India. Professor Rubin, all yours.
Thank you, General. I mean, you give me a little bit too much credit. I'm a historian, so I get paid to predict the past. I don't necessarily have a crystal ball about the future. That said, look, I mean, what we do know is ever since the George W. Bush administration, across both Republicans and Democratic administrations in the White House, the U.S.-India relationship has grown stronger. I'm afraid that while the trajectory will still be forward, we're going to have more stumbling blocks in the coming administration for reasons General Moorthy spoke about than perhaps we're used to. What I worry about with regard to Kamala Harris is here we have a woman who doesn't really have any idea about foreign policy. When she was vice president, which was her only real exposure to a foreign policy, she was basically kept in the corner, considered an embarrassment, considered, for lack of a better word, an idiot by people in the White House who didn't want to let her get near anything of sensitivity. Yes, she made a few trips abroad, but there was no real trust put in her. And she was also someone who seems, on a personal level, quite resistant to learning. And in this, she has something very much in common with Donald Trump. The numbers of people whom she cycled through among her immediate staff is just astounding. And I know a lot of her staff members who couldn't wait to get out of there. I mean, consider that even right when she became the presumptive presidential nominee for the Democratic Party, before that was formalized yesterday, her husband's foreign policy advisor quit because just couldn't take it anymore. And now her husband's foreign policy advisor is actually an intern who just left the university less than 4 months ago. I mean, the fact of the matter is, she's someone that when she's not in front of the teleprompter, and here she has something like in common with Joe Biden, her staff never knows in what direction she's going to do, and they spend most of their time playing cleanup. And again, that's something which Donald Trump's staff also engages in. What I worry about, we have an adage in Washington that personnel is policy. So Kamala Harris becomes president, let's say. She's the figurehead. And in the United States, the presidency isn't as strong as in other countries. And so the adage goes that personnel is policy. Who is she going to appoint? What I worry about is coming from California, and not just California, coming from San Francisco, having her comfort set be Hollywood, which is basically about as progressive as you can be. I'm not sure that her instincts on foreign policy are going to be to stand up to the human rights community, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and so forth. I'm afraid that while many in the development community traditionally, and many in the political community, including in democratic administrations, understand that these marquee human rights groups have political agendas, and that therefore they should be taken with a grain of salt. I'm not sure whether those surrounding Kamala Harris, let alone Kamala Harris herself, truly understand that, especially if it are Hollywood actors whispering into her ears. So while even within the Biden administration, however critical I can be of the Biden administration, we've had an ability to check the worst excesses of the progressive squad, of Hollywood, and so forth when it comes to foreign policy. I'm not sure Kamala Harris will put people as political appointees in the State Department that are willing to stand up to that. If she were to choose someone like Samantha Power, for example, it would become a problem. The mental test I would challenge everyone in the audience to think about is if an India-Canada crisis occurred, if Justin Trudeau opens his mouth during a Harris administration, would the reaction in Washington be different than it was in the Biden administration? In the Biden administration, we tried to assuage Justin Trudeau while making clear behind the scenes that we were working with India and that we weren't going to throw India under the bus. Not everything that came out of our mouths India liked, but behind the scenes, there were mature people that the Indians could talk with in order to manage this crisis. Do you think that in a Kamala Harris administration, the same would be true? So I worry that we are going to undercut with, look, Americans can be arrogant, we can navel gaze, we don't have a good sense of history, and we can preach. Our diplomats too often like to act as colonial commissars. Now, if they are believing the human rights narratives run amok, if they embrace the academic Marxist narratives, for example, about caste, are we going to start having people in the State Department who know nothing about India start lecturing Indians about supposed civil rights concerns, about caste, about so forth? Are we going to have a reaction, especially if Kamala Harris is elected and Arab activists in Minnesota and Michigan claim credit for that? Are they going to try to replicate the same campaign they ran against people like Governor Josh Shapiro in Pennsylvania, against Indian Americans, especially those who might respect the democratic choice of the Indian people, the largest democracy, who have repeatedly elected, despite the last election, Prime Minister Modi? I mean, are we going to have a Modi derangement syndrome in the United States the way we have a Netanyahu derangement syndrome in the United States? And I'm afraid that could be the case. There's two other issues I worry about with regard to Kamala Harris. One is, and this is where I'll differ a little bit with General Moorthy, is with regard to Phil Gordon, who likely would be Kamala Harris's national security advisor. He has a track record. He's a longtime Brookings scholar. He worked in the Obama administration. Obviously, he works in the Biden administration. He's a solid guy. I've heard him debate. He actually debated with my wife once on a public panel. At the same time, I find him to be a little bit, give too much credulity to our adversaries. I mean, he talked about how Russia was withdrawing from Syria when they weren't withdrawing from Syria. He was confusing the rhetoric with the reality and so forth. But what I worry about is some of the issues which he wrote about with regard to Pakistan back in 2007. And granted, American policy towards Pakistan has evolved a little bit. Not enough. But what he basically argued is we need to defer to the Pakistani military to take on radicalism. This he wrote in 2007 because the Pakistani military has a better sense of the tribal dynamics, the local geography, and so forth than the Americans do. And so he doesn't seem to be cognizant of the games that the ISI plays, this extremism extortion, I like to call it, in which they demand that we provide billions of dollars in aid to take on extremists without actually being cognizant that they're never going to defeat the extremists, because that would end the gravy train of billions of dollars into their bank accounts. And so I worry about too much deference to Pakistan in this case, which would of course have negative implications. When we look at Tim Walz, the governor of Minnesota, everyone knows he honeymooned in the People's Republic of China. He took more than 30 trips to China during his time as governor, even when he was serving in the U.S. military and so forth. The fact of the matter is, he seems to have a very much a soft spot for China, and just to be generous. What he's basically argued is we can get more with honey than we can with vinegar from China, that we can engage China. We have to look at them with nuance. And remember, he went to China right after the Tiananmen Square crackdown. He doesn't seem to be someone who's willing to stand up to China. If there is a crisis between China and India, let's say in Arunachal Pradesh or in Ladakh, what have you, he would be someone who would try to find some way, some compromise in the middle. And the analogy I would make is when you have a hornet's nest, you have two good options. One is to get rid of it. The other option is to do nothing. But the worst possible option is always the compromise, to stand underneath the hornet's nest, lightly tapping it with a stick. And I'm afraid that's what he would be prone to. Now, we don't know that he's actually going to have a foreign policy portfolio if he becomes vice president. But I think it's safe to say that he would try to carve out a portfolio, especially because Kamala Harris doesn't really have an interest in foreign policy that we can see. That Walz would carve out a portfolio that would include China. And in this case, across U.S. administrations, the United States has a tendency, when we have a conflict between a dictatorship and a democracy, too often our diplomats will try to extract concessions from a democracy because they conceive of it as easier, even though that sets a negative trend, a negative example that in the long term doesn't do us any favor strategically. With regard to Donald Trump, and I'll make this part quicker, the biggest difference between Trump version 1.0 and Trump version 2.0 is that it's going to take a lot less time for Trump version 2.0 to hit the ground running. That's because whereas in Trump version 1.0, it could take up to 18 to 20 months for him to get his people who had never served in government, the security clearances, the background investigations, and all of that. This time, many of the people which he might bring in have already had security clearances, so they only need to update the last 4 years or so. Second of all, whereas Trump came in thinking that, I mean, with his typical arrogance and buffoonery, that he could just dictate the way the U.S. government worked, the way he did when he was in business. The fact of the matter is he learned very quickly, or actually he didn't learn, his staff learned very quickly, that the U.S. government isn't as efficient, isn't as malleable, and it actually takes an understanding of the processes of which levers to pull in order to achieve policy. Trump version 2.0 isn't going to have the same learning curve. Whether you agree with Trump's agenda or disagree with Trump's agenda, he's going to be much more efficient in implementing that agenda. Now, when it comes to India, I agree with what the general said with regard to protectionism and so forth. I'm a small government conservative. The reason why I'm critical of Trump is I don't see him as a conservative. I see him as a populist, and in the long term, I see that as wrong for our economy. I also don't believe he can conceive of multilateral trade partnerships, trade agreements. He prefers just a series of bilateral. Let's put that aside. I think his focus, instead of being on South Asia, is going to be on the Middle East. He's going to try to build upon the Abraham Accords. The Saudis are going to try to reward him by perhaps joining. This will leave India to the professionals, India policy in the United States. And then the question becomes, who would shape India policy under a Trump administration? I suspect that despite the populism, despite J.D. Vance's populism as well, that India, by not being in the limelight, that India-U.S. relations would suffer fewer roadblocks, despite the protectionism which we have, and that Congress would continue to advance the U.S.-India relations. I really do believe, even though I don't know who the heck I would vote for in this election, talks on both their houses. I do think that Kamala Harris is going to do much more public and serious damage to the partnership than a Trump administration would. But with that, let me turn the floor back over.
Thanks a lot, Professor Rubin. You've given a very clear idea from the inside as to what India can expect, depending on who gets elected. But what I liked about the whole thing is, it doesn't matter whether it's Kamala Harris or Trump, your view that both have shown a reluctance to learn, and which means they're going to come with a lot of prefixed ideas. And that is something we have to learn, that how to deal with these prefixed ideas. I think that is important, because if the other side doesn't learn and we also don't learn and we also don't show that maturity, we will be in trouble. But you focus a lot on Kamala Harris and her likely weaknesses on the foreign policy, which is unknown. I mean, like I said in the beginning, this presidency is about an unknown Kamala Harris and a known Trump, right? And even within the known Trump, you could get a lot of variations, if I put it mildly, right? Like protectionism and the future in the Middle East and defocus on many issues. But overall, I tend to agree with you that the relationship between India and USA will have far less roadblocks with Trump. With Kamala Harris, the India-USA relationship will have to get on to getting a new normal set. We have to find the new normal when Kamala Harris comes, because we do know that she's got a propensity to go towards the human rights issues. She's a little tough on Kashmir, and you're right to the extent there is a Pakistan lobby which is still alive in USA, and that could come to the forefront, and then there would be a whole lot of issues which will come up, right? And more importantly, I think with Kamala Harris, one doesn't know how her views on Middle East will play out. Of course, though she's indicated that she'll go ahead with her support to Ukraine, right? The important part in all these four, whether the president and the vice president combo in all four, is the issue of the vice presidential candidate for the Democrats, who who spent a lot of time in China and who could go soft on China. How that will play out and how Americans will accept it is something for the Americans to decide, for America to decide. But for us, it is for us to know that we might not get the same geopolitical support from USA should Kamala Harris and her vice president nominee get elected. This is a possibility. I'm not saying it's a probability. And I won't say what kind of a possibility it is. The probability is there. We should be alive to this. Right. With this, General Gurjit sir, Ambassador Gurjit sir, I already called you a general. My mistake, but that's okay. Ambassador and the general generally think alike. That's what I've seen in my interaction so far. Ambassador sir, all yours, please take on.
Thank you. Pardon my being late. But I heard General Moorthy and Professor Rubin with great interest. I think General Moorthy covered the whole gamut of relationships, and I really loved Professor Rubin's frank discussion and assessment of the candidates. So, we are once again in a US presidential election cycle. So, we all must stand to attention. That is what the world's biggest democracy demands of us. Right? Now, we are having an election whose contours have changed about a month ago when Biden stepped down from the candidacy and Kamala Harris was astonishingly given charge. As a result, the predictability of dealing with a known Trump and a known Biden is now hit with an unpredictability. And the nature of the election has also changed. But if you see the two candidates' style of campaigning, it is actually a non-issue campaign. It is both slanging each other, weird versus bad looking or whatever. There is no issues being debated. So it's if you want to put it academically, it's a perception winning battle. Mm-hmm. Now, in this, I think it is risky to determine what their policy will be. So all that is only conjecture. And largely, we have to understand the following. There is an equation between Trump and Modi, and it will need to be revived, but that should not be that difficult because after all, Modi did stick his neck out at the last elections for Trump and Biden won. Secondly, Kamala Harris, which as Professor Rubin said, the Americans call Kamala, is not an Indian candidate for the presidency. So we should not expect sympathy, empathy, relationship building with us. In her entire 4 years as vice president, there is no visit to India by Kamala Harris. So therefore, I think that part, like, those expectations of Rishi Sunak, which fell flat soon after, we should avoid that pitfall and treat Kamala Harris as an American candidate of the Democratic Party who will respond to that party's electoral requirements for now. Now, certainly, Trump is again reviving the MAGA, and which means protectionism, particularly strong against immigration, which he holds Kamala responsible for, and things like that, which I think both General Moorthy and General Shankar pointed out are areas of concern to the Indian diaspora and consequently to India. Because we have made diaspora policy a core element of our foreign policy. So now there's no getting away from that. Where the Harris campaign is concerned, they are trying very hard to win a majority in Congress and the Senate, which means, those elements like Premila Jayapal, the OCA, and all those people who have a fringe, but an important fringe requirement of the Democratic Party, and who have backed Kamala in the past, are going to, at least for now, be important in agenda setting. Now, if you look at the Democratic Party platform, which I think they have not updated from the time that Biden was going to be the candidate, it seems to be the same. One noticeable difference, while in the last two campaign platforms of the Democratic Party, the world was listed alphabetically. This time, the Atlantic Alliance comes first, Europe, and then comes Asia and the Indo-Pacific. So, even alphabetically, we have not been able to win this battle. The Biden administration has put much faith on alliances, and therefore NATO and Europe is important. The Indo-Pacific is important also because Japan, Australia, Korea have become like NATO partners. We are the only ones who are not. And perhaps in the last year of the Biden administration, we have suffered neglect. Since G20, when Biden came to India, there has actually been no high-level meeting. Everything is left to the level of Blinken. And I think the bad things are said by Jake Sullivan. The good things are said by Blinken. So they are playing this bad security advisor, good diplomat game with us. But I think India understands this. We are not Johnny-come-latelys. So I would say two things now at this stage. First, when our ambassador to the United States retired and came back, the potential ambassador was actually going to be foreign secretary till October. But suddenly you find that he's already gone to Washington without waiting for the end of his extended tenure in October. He's already in position. So India realizes that the changed circumstances in Washington means that you have to make a bigger investment in understanding the potential Harris administration, because it is not going to be simply a clone of the Biden administration. The second thing is that in April, Vice President Harris brought in a PIO, Siddharth Iyer, who for 13 years was in the Department of Defense. And since April, he's a special advisor to the Vice President on the Indo-Pacific. So I am not certain that the Indo-Pacific is necessarily going to be neglected. It may not be the prime focus, but I think they have appointed a special advisor now, recently. So, they understand that this is important. When Kamala Harris was named the candidate, a country like Japan, who were counting on Aso Taro and Hitoshi Motegi as two important people who knew Trump. Please remember, Prime Minister Kishida doesn't know Trump. He was elected after Trump lost the election. So these two people were the LDP's point people to deal with a resurgent Trump. And actually, Taro Aso went to, New York and spent an hour with Trump. But once Kamala Harris became into the picture, now there was nobody who knew Kamala Harris. So I think we have the same issue. But what is common to all of us, the Japanese, the Australians, and us, the ASEAN, that whenever we've had meetings in DC, our leaders have had occasion to address Congress, joint session of Congress, which means they met Kamala Harris. All of these. So even when Prime Minister Modi addressed Congress last year, in June, I think, I remember him turning around and saying the links between us are so great. The diaspora and one Indian diaspora is sitting right behind me. So that acknowledgement is there. And, I think when Modi was there and when Rajnath Singh and 2+2 happened, there were certain conversations. I fully agree with Professor Rubin that she was a neglected part of the administration. But I think at times, efforts were made by partners like us to find a way to talk to her. I think she had a lunch for the Prime Minister, if I'm not wrong, when he went on a bilateral with him. She came to the EAS meeting in September 2023, and she met with V. Now, this is one point where I think I differ with Professor Rubin. China is not going to countenance being dealt with at a vice presidential level. China is going to be dealt only by a US president. So Trump or Kamala Harris, they will have to deal with Xi, or they will be reduced to dealing with the premier, who is a lightweight. So not a serious person. Now, having said this, and I think we have discussed who are the possible candidates who could be in the administration. And I think Professor Rubin is absolutely right. Perhaps the settling down time of Trump administration may be faster than before. But I have a caution here. I think all those people who led the Trump administration, the turnover is so rapid and none of them are now around. I don't see McMaster, I don't see Pence, I don't see Nikki Haley until she comes back. So I don't know who is going to be there. So while security clearance may be faster, our understanding of them may be slower. I remember last time when Trump took over, we invested a lot in his daughter and son-in-law to actually try and reach, because there was no administration. But this time I think they will probably come with a better preparation. But frankly, the same I think is true of Kamala Harris. I don't think she's going to just bring the Biden administration in. She will have her own. I think I heard you mention Samantha Power, but I think that's who are more likely saying is not going to happen as going to happen. So I think there will be a new set of Democrats who will come and man, because Kamala Harris is already vice president. The transition would perhaps be smoother with changes coming within a year. There may be people put into brackets now, but as she comes into her own within a year, I think there will be changes. Now, I think we need to realize that over the last 2 decades, India-US relationship has improved beyond anybody's imagination. This is not based on China. It is not based on Pakistan. It is based on a realization of mutual benefit and our place in the world. Traditionally, now in the last 2 decades, we have been better off with a Republican administration than a Democratic administration. We did well with Biden, but the last 1 year has been a bit disappointing. For one thing, earlier they were giving primacy to India in South Asia. It's certainly not providing that. The issues like the Khalistan terrorism rankle in India. So there are many wrinkles and rankling moments with the Biden administration. And that alone would make India perhaps fine for a Trump administration. Fine. But that may not happen in the United States. So I think we are now prepared to deal with both. If we could have dealt with Trump 1.0, frankly, I think the Indian diplomacy can deal with anything in the United States. I'm going to stop there now. Thank you.
I I think you hit the nail on the head, sir. If we can deal with Trump 1.0 successfully, which we did, right? We can deal with anything. On that note, I mean, that sums up what you said, and right. But then, a few issues which you have brought into, focus is important. Uh, the the fact that if Trump comes, there's an existing equation between Modi and Trump, right? If Kamala Harris comes, the fact that she's not an Indian candidate for American presidency is something which we should understand. I think these are two critical things which we have to focus on. The next thing is about the India-US relationship, which you actually put across, is Biden and his staff understood alliances and partnerships well. For 3 years, they did well on this. It's only in the last year issues have gone back. Would that be the same with Trump? Actually, if you look back, the Quad came up during the Trump administration. Right? So it might not be that bad right? And of course, it depends on who comes in. Either way, we're going to deal with the new stuff. So this is something which I'm not too worried about with the Trump administration, right? Despite the fact that a new set of people are going to come. The thing which worries me, and I'll be blunt about it, and so I'm picking it up from what you people have said. With the Kamala Harris administration, the fringe gaining the center. The fringe gaining the center is a matter of worry. And the fringe gaining center on human rights, on Khalistan issue, and on Kashmir will be great irritants. The irritants might be small, but they'll be like sandpaper, one coming after the other. And that might rub off on the overall Indo-US relationship. Yeah, and we have to be conscious of the fact that we are starting at a pretty low point at this point of time. So the moment you get in and you're going to start hearing about, all those, the sandpapering starts, then we're going to be in a problem. And the fact which I'll not discount, irrespective of who's the president or not, right, is that Pakistan has a way of getting around US administrations. And you see a revival of sorts, in fact, more than a revival of sorts in their equation. With a democratic administration, this could go to the next level, right? But as far as China is concerned, my own gut feeling is that both have no choice but to be tough on China. And if they have to be tough on China, they need India. And I'm very clear, I'm sanguine about it, that without turning towards India, they can't handle China. To that extent, the stabilizing factor, if you look at it, the stabilizing factor in the Indo-US relationship will actually be Xi and China. If you look at it from a different point of view, they will force stabilization, because if the India-US relationship breaks or goes down, right, China will be the happiest of the lot. And I think that realization is there both in India and in USA. The last thing I would like to put across, which actually Ambassador GURJIT did put across in as many words, while the administrations in USA, irrespective of which candidate comes, will be new, the administration in India is pretty balanced and stable. This is the second, in fact, some of them are on the third 10 years, right? And they have, and we are pretty stable. And I suspect, I wouldn't suspect, I'm pretty sure, there's a realization within our administration that the road ahead with India and US needs to be done differently. And that's why a lot of things are being put in place. As we are speaking, we have our Prime Minister sitting in Ukraine, and our defense minister heading to USA,
in the
already
US.
mending fences. Yeah, in the US, 23rd. Yeah, in the US, mending fences. So we're getting our act together. And it's a matter of time that America gets its act together. I'll put it as bluntly as that. If America doesn't get its act together, should be prepared overall, irrespective of how it deals or not deals, that China will gain an upper hand. The classic case, which Ambassador Gurjit pointed out, I think it's a very important case. How do you deal with Z? Would you like to deal with Z's premier or himself on a one-to-one basis? Is the crux of the whole story. To that extent, I would give full marks to Prime Minister Modi, who has dealt with Xi Jinping one-to-one. And the messages have been absolutely blunt and straight one-to-one, whichever way you look at it. So that realization needs to be set in. And I think it's time, if they've not realized, Americans must realize our sensitivities with Pakistan. And if that is not realized, then we will be now tempted, or probably we might have to go in for our own options. And Prime Minister Modi is capable of taking certain hard decisions on this, America or no America. And this has been demonstrated. I'm not talking of conjecture, I'm here talking of demonstration. We've done it in Balakot, we've done it in both the surgical strikes we've carried out. So I think I've summed up the whole thing. If there's anyone else who has a view to say, I'll give a minute each before I take questions. Gautam Moorthy, sir.
I would like to reiterate something that Professor Michael Rubin said, that the attention of the US is going to be on the Middle East and and towards Ukraine and Russia. And that may be a good thing for India, whichever administration comes in. Because India is doing, as you yourself brought out, General Shankar, that we are doing a lot of work from, I won't say behind the scenes, official thing, building on official documents, building on the official relationships. That is only going to take it to a higher level. So without you being in the show window and what's showing up in the relationship, in whichever way you say it, of the Khalistani issue or anything else, and US being cognizant of India's sensitivities, we could be working on strengthening our strategic relationship, whichever administration comes in, because their focus, as Professor Rubin has very rightly brought out, is going to be on the Middle East and is going to be on the Russia-Ukraine war, both of which would see a winding down, or rather they would like to see a winding down of both these wars. So this is what I have to say on this issue. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Professor Rubin.
Sure, just very quick notes. First of all, I think that while we're talking about the 2024 election, one thing that seems increasingly certain is that the 2028 election will be back to normal. Trump will have washed out of the system. If the so-called MAGA faction does poorly in certain locations, it's not going to be the electoral goldenrod that perhaps some who are embracing that sort of populism believe. And so and we've seen with the Democratic sweepstakes with the Democrats that there is a deep field. So that's positive. I would also argue that, going back to George H.W. Bush in the 1990s, the U.S. foreign policy has been defined. The legacy of each president has been defined by the crisis which no one saw coming during the campaign. So we can pretend that either Harris or Trump is going to shape American policy, but oftentimes that policy is shaped in reaction to event. Could it be Venezuela-Guyana war? Could it be a Rwanda-Congo war? Could it be something that we simply don't have on our radar screen? With regard to some of what Ambassador Gurjit Singh said, I agree and I disagree. Certainly, the ambassador is absolutely right. Look, Z is going to be dealt with by the president. The point I was trying to make, however, is that Kamala Harris is an empty vessel, And behind the scenes on a day-to-day basis, it depends on who is writing the words that go into her teleprompter. What basically happens, and this was certainly the case with Cheney and Bush, for example, it was the case with Gore and Clinton, is that vice presidents get certain portfolios. And even if the president is the one in the meeting, on a day-to-day basis, they have the ability to shape the policy. So I suspect that there is going to be, within the White House, a break on the most robust policy that China hawks might want to take in Washington. And when we look at U.S. policy over the last decade or so, I'd say the real legacy of the Trump administration is he fundamentally changed the American political debate with regard to China. Prior to Trump, China was much more of a partisan issue. The Republicans were hawkish, the Democrats much less so. Now there's much more consensus. And the question then is whether Waltz is able to roll that back. And then the final, when it comes to security clearances, of course, the principals don't need clearances. What I worry about is some of the staffers. But regardless, I mean, the only real surprise I could see is if someone like Mike Flynn comes back as National Security Advisor. That's going to be the post to watch, simply because the National Security Advisor does not need to have Senate confirmation. So you could have some real wild cards there in a Trump administration. And the last point I would make is just an irony that as we, if the Democrats win, are going to increasingly lecture India about its own domestic policies, about its caste system and so forth, as we embrace racial politics in the United States, the irony is that our mindset is going to be much more into a caste system than modern India's is. And I simply hope that Indian politicians will point this out repeatedly and robustly to their American counterparts.
Ambassador, sir, all yours.
Thank you, Professor Rubin. Thank you for clarifying what you meant. I understand it more. And I would like your last point also. So I think there is an anticipation that in a Harris administration, at least for the first year, there would be much of this lecturing that you talked to. This is what with Germany we get from the Green foreign minister. But what we do? We make a statement and then let it be. We don't let that become the core of the relationship. And in Germany, we have built a very successful relationship with Chancellor Scholz, who is next month going to be back in India. So I think the effort of Indian diplomacy will be to build a successful relationship with those elements of a new administration who listen to us. And those who are lecturing us will be heard and put into cold storage, frankly, as of now. I mean, that happens even now. And I don't think the Americans are going to change. It is just we have to sharpen our ability to deal with those elements in the United States who are listening to us and who are important to us. The Defense Department is very important to us. We need to keep buying arms from the United States. We need to get the engines for our new plane, which are stalled. So we need to get this agenda going. We know that the trade agenda is not going to do. Whether it is the Harris or the Trump administration, they are not going to let WTO function. Their interest in climate change remains unidimensional. So we are okay with that. We can live with it. But we can't live without the defense cooperation. So I think, therefore, the fact that Rajnath Singh, defense minister, is now in what could be considered a lame duck administration, is still going to make these things up. That shows how seriously we treat the United States in some areas where we see dependence developing. Thank you.
Absolutely correct.
Thanks a lot, sir. I think you also made some very good points in the end. All the points have been made, but I want to highlight one point about this election, and that actually has been troubling me for quite some time, and I'm going to put it out, take it for what it's worth. You know, if you see the American system of electing presidents, all the candidates are put through a grill. They go through the primaries, they go through, where each candidate is ripped apart. There's a lot of debate. And in that that the character of that candidate, the orientation of that candidate, his philosophy, his policy, whatever it comes out. In the case of Kamala Harris, she's bypassed all that. And the fact is that despite being a vice president for 4 years, actually no one has heard her enunciate anything. So, strictly speaking, from a foreign policy point of view, what she does for America, the Americans can, sort it out with internally. But what she does externally is a big question mark. And that question mark puts me in a bit of doubt. I mean, with Trump, at least I know what he's going to do, right. The only hope, like I said, in fact, the only confidence I take away from this whole story is what Ambassador said. If you drill to Trump 1.0, you can drill with anyone else, right? So I'll leave it at that. I'll take a few questions because there are a lot of comments, but few questions which, measure up to what we've been speaking of. Okay. This is a thing which I would like, anyone can take on, right? He says, Bharat today is not only the fulcrum, but also remains the center of global geopolitics, revolving around the IOR and related global trade, logistics, and safe passage. Your views. And I think I'll put it there. Does America realize this? The point is, if you look at the globe, towards the west, you have a huge war going on. Towards the east, in South China Sea, the conflict is almost teetering on getting into a war-like situation. In the north, you have issues related to, Ukraine has been raging well into the third year with no end in sight. And the Indian Ocean region, repeatedly the Red Sea channel getting clogged. And also combine it with what's happening in the Panama Canal, where the traffic has reduced. The Indian Ocean region and the SLOCs have assumed importance. With all this, India's global value has gone up, whether you like it or not. So is that realization there in the United States of America? And the political circles who are going to make decisions? Let me ask this question to Rubin. Professor Rubin, you're yours.
Okay, very, very shortly. Yes, it's there, although sometimes the Americans make assumptions with regard to what India will agree to or not agree to as we partner. For example, whether the Quad is a quasi-NATO or not, that's something where there might be very different perspectives in Washington than in New Delhi, and so diplomats have their work cut out for them. When it comes to the India Ocean region, my own pet peeve is that India doesn't pay enough attention to the African littoral states, where there's a real competition going on. But if I may just conclude by addressing something you had said, General Shankar, with regard to how the rise of Kamala Harris has worked. Remember, about a century ago, it was considered gauche for presidential candidates to even campaign. People would campaign on their behalf, but they wouldn't campaign themselves. And then up until around 60 years ago, you wouldn't necessarily have the party primaries. One of the biggest problems, and we saw this back in 2020, is that neither the Democrats nor the Republicans actually have an ability to impose their brand on the people coming out of the primary. So Donald Trump was a lifelong Democrat who hijacked the Republican Party for his own purposes. Bernie Sanders was a lifelong socialist who almost succeeded doing the same thing to the Democrats. In many ways, as undemocratic as Kamala Harris's rise within the Democratic Party has been, it actually is going back to what once was normal, where the party leaders themselves decide what they stand for and then put someone forward for the general election.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for that clarification. Right. I'll take this question because he's from Bangladesh and he's put this question 4 times, though it's not probably fully related to what we had been talking of. I am from Bangladesh. I want to know why current US government enjoys destroying the peace of our lives in South Asia using its foolish radical agent Pakistan. I'll not I'll not direct this at Michael. You might have the last say on it. Ambassador Gurjit, sir, your view, because you've been in this arena a bit.
Oh, well, if you look at the earlier question and this question, there's an underlying thing that our priorities, are they US priorities? Whether it's Bangladesh or it is Indian Ocean. So I think that we need to be a little circumspect. We should not expect our priorities to be US priorities unless we can persuade them. So that challenge is there. In the last 1 year, we are not able to persuade them. But I think things could change. Now, regarding the littoral of Africa, the Indo-Pacific littoral, I think there actually much more is happening through India over the last 2 or 3 years than is visible. So I think India is now part of the competition fully, but we are doing things a little bit differently because we do not have the deep pockets of China or Turkey or the UAE, but what we are doing is different from all of them. And I think we are respected for that. So I think that is the wait and watch scenario. The important thing is we are doing that without waiting for American signals or support. We have French cooperation, not so much American. So I think, as has been pointed out, that American priorities would be West Asia and Ukraine, leaving lesser time for our region. India must step out and say, this is what I am doing, persuade America that this is good for them as well. And that, if you work together, I think we'll be able to better manage South Asia and keep it out of the Chinese hold, otherwise, which is becoming a struggle. Thank you.
Yes, I think that's well put, because from all indications which we are getting, this preoccupation of USA with human rights and democracy and all that gives an opportunity, a window of opportunity for China. I only hope someone in someone in USA realizes this, right? But because at this point of time, unfortunately, no one would realize it, because American politics is looking inwards to elect their president. But will this whole story last out the next 6 months to make the new president realize this is the challenge? But then we leave it to people like Michael Rubin, because in 6 months' time, what we are discussing today is history, and it will be completely his turf to take it up in the right forums. Right. Okay. The next question I have is, a person who put this question even before the webinar started. So General Gautam Moorthy, sir, this is to you. Ask, irrespective of result, how will US-Pak relation go forward after the election?
Good question. I did try to address it in my opening remarks because I saw that question and I had already thought I'd be speaking something on the US-Pakistan relations. You see, whichever US administration has been in power over the years, they all understand the primacy of the US military in the polity of Pakistan. That unfortunately has come to stay and has only become stronger. So the US-Pakistan relation will continue on a blow-hot, blow-cold basis. US will demand action and certain very clear-cut action on the Pakistan military, result-oriented action. But at the same time, the US will not pressurize Pakistan to the extent that we in India would like it to do, because as long as the terrorism problem is contained within Pakistan, the US can live with it. The only thing that's important is that Pakistan should not be exporting terrorism to other parts of the globe. They're terrorist entities. When I say Pakistani terrorists, I mean I include the border area, the Badlands, between Pakistan and Afghanistan. And today, Pakistan is embroiled in handling their own internal security. To that extent, they will be focusing inwards. They would look to monetary support from America and from the institutions that the US supports. So, to that extent, they would look to curry favors with the United States. And the United States would repay those favors, would like to repay those favors in whichever manner possible.
Thank you, sir, for this view. I have a view to add on this. In India, I think we need to realize that today US needs Pakistan. I mean, I'm going to open a new thing altogether. US needs Pakistan because Pakistan has a huge common border with Iran, and USA is worried about Iran. Right? Take all the things which have been happening between Iran and Israel, and Iran and every other country out there with Houthis and Hezbollah and Hamas and all that. Iran has to be kept in check. If you have to keep Iran in check, you need Pakistan, and that has been amply demonstrated. Also, to have some modicum of control on Afghanistan, right? They'll need Pakistan. Most importantly, they will not let Pakistan go. In fact, no US administration can let Pakistan go, because if Pakistan goes out of their grip, it will go into China's lap. Will any administration allow that to happen? I don't think so. The very fact that the IMF has got its hooks fully into Pakistan financially, right, and it's dangling it from there and drip feeding it, because after that experience with Afghanistan, that's what I can make out. They're just drip feeding Pakistan on a survival basis. I think we should expect US to continue to be engaged with Pakistan. How it will get engaged and how it will go forward is an issue. It will be transactional, and we'll have to see going forward. But that's my view. Let's see how it plays out. If there's any, please, Michael.
Just very quickly, I'd push back a little bit, because Pakistan's not going to have the same leverage that they had with regard to Afghanistan policy, simply because Iran isn't landlocked. But as to the specific question, this is what I would urge everyone to look at over the next 4 years. Will the United States mentally decouple India from Pakistan? And if we are truly respecting India, if we are putting the history dating back to Truman and Nehru behind us, then are we willing to, for example, send the Secretary of State to New Delhi without a corollary trip to Islamabad? Too often it's been the assumptions of diplomacy that we have to treat the two countries equally. The fact of the matter is the relations are no longer equal. We don't need to treat India and Pakistan equally. And this is what I would look at as the metric for the development and the maturity of India-US policy.
Thanks a lot. I think there's a clear realization within India that this relationship has been dehyphenated long back, one. And two, there's a equally realization within India that we have to look beyond Pakistan. But Pakistan exists, so we have to deal with it, and we'll deal with it. US has interest in Pakistan. USA will pursue its interest with Pakistan, so we'll live with it, and we'll understand it, and we'll handle it. But for the past 3 to 4 years, I think there's a lot of dehyphenation already done, both from the US and the Indian perspective. If you want to have anything else to say, so Ambassador sir, your word on this, and then we'll close it. Yeah, fine. Thanks a lot. I think we've covered this whole ground well. This is only the first part of the story. I mean, please remember, all those who are watching, a lot of what we spoke is in the realm of conjecture. We are only looking forward and seeing what can be. It is not what will be. It is what can be. So that we are mentally agile as to what we are going to look. And like what Professor Michael Rubin said, the agenda for tomorrow will be set by events of tomorrow. So that tomorrow has not yet come, right? So we're just trying to look into tomorrow and hope like hell everything falls into place and be prepared for it. And that's where I leave it. Because sure enough, maybe just before the elections or something, we're going to have a second round and see where things have matured and where the whole trajectory of this US elections and the India-US relations are going to go, and how do you think this trajectory will shape out? We'll come back to you in a month or so. Last, I would like to thank Bharas for becoming a member of Ganashot, and General Gautam Moorthy, sir, you could give a small vote of thanks and close the program for the evening.
Thank you very much, Professor Michael Rubin, for sparing your time all the way from the US to share your views with us. Thank you, Ambassador Gurjit, who has rushed in after a long air journey to our road drive and got in straight into the webinar, dived in and shared his wonderful views with us. And thank you, of course, General Shankar, for hosting this discussion and your perceptive views on where this relationship and how our relationship will get impacted with either Kamala Harris becoming the president or Mr. Donald Trump becoming the president. And above all, I would like to thank all the viewers of your channel who have been listening in patiently and the viewers who are going to be listening in onto this. So thank you all very much for participating in this webinar. Goodbye, good luck, and Jai Hind to everyone. Thank you.
Jai Hind.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm very happy to see you, Professor Rubin.
Thank you.
Yeah.